record this in case anyone misses it. I had some folks say, hey, would you please record it because I'm not going to be able to make it tonight. So I'm recording this. Anyway, hi, I'm Kevin. I have to get back into my Zoom legs. I haven't had to do Zoom in a while, so I hope this is working. I hope you can hear me, and we will get going here. All right. So let me share my screen and we'll have our little walkabout. Okay. Okay, from the beginning. And let me move my chat window out of the way here so we may go. Okay, so hi, my name is Kevin. Someone's saying that you hear me loud and clear. Thank you so much for confirming. Everyone's muted, so I just wanted to make sure. Okay, so my name is Kevin. I'm going to be your guide for this presentation through the rest of the year, and we are going to march on into next year with these as well. So the theory is we're going to get to do all of the decades as we make our way along. So my colleague is going to be helping me with these, letting folks in, but here we go. So if you have any questions, I am going to type my contact information in here. You are welcome to send me some questions in the chat window, either during the presentation or after. And I will watch for chat questions if you have them. You may also unmute if you have any questions. Okay, so I have learned over the years to make a few announcements at the beginning, just so there will be no misunderstandings. First of all, a reminder, we are not covering everything. This is a decade, an entire decade in history. We are absolutely not covering everything that we could be covering in this presentation in that time. So we're covering a lot, but not everything. So please be gentle if you think I have not covered something that you really, really like. In the picture you see here, this is someone's drawing of the intersection of the South Platte River and Cherry Creek. As you see there, the mountains in the distance, and there's a whole bunch of not Denver. All right. Also, this is a presentation about the history of Denver. So we are not going to spend a lot of time talking about the folks who were here before. This is about the city of Denver and its history. So by no means are the stories that came before not important. That's just not the focus of today's presentation. So I'm not going to touch on that a lot. That'll be a presentation perhaps for another time. And then lastly, I was thinking about it today. I have been traveling with a lot of you for years. I recognize some of the names and faces of the folks on this presentation, but there are a lot of you that are new to me. I apologize. I'm going to have to give a presentation as if you don't know anything, because I don't know who might be a new person here, might have just moved here. So I don't want to assume that you know anything. So I apologize should any of this be redundant for you. All right, with those little caveats, let's get going. The Queen City of the Prairie. Many of you might be saying, but Kevin, it's not the Queen City of the Prairie, it's the Queen City of the Plains. Well, it would become the Queen City of the Plains, but at least at first, the folks in Denver preferred the Queen City of the Prairie. So that was sort of our first nickname. We would move on. So we start with the Queen City of the Prairie. All right, some things, some notables from that time period. And again, by no means is this exhaustive. Founded in 1858. Now, that is not the first gold strike that happened in Colorado. The first gold strike that we know happened in Colorado actually turns out to have been in what is today Arvada in 1850. That gold strike was basically forgotten. It really wasn't until the 1970s that that was brought up again and really verified as being authentic. That gold strike was forgotten because those fellows were on their way to California, where there was so much gold, it was going to eclipse the paltry gold they found there in what is today Arvada. For those of you who haven't been there, Gold Strike Park in Arvada, right near I-76 and Sheridan, they do have interpretive signs there. So the one that stuck, the one that started the gold rush in this area was the one in 1858. 1859, the Leavenworth and Pikes Peak Express Company gets here. That's a stagecoach, basically transportation. Before we would get the train, you either had to walk, ride your own horse, or take a horse and cart of some sort. So having a stagecoach that would have gotten you out here was important. And very importantly, it didn't go to any of our local rivals. Boulder, Golden, even Littleton could have stolen the thunder if the stagecoach had come there, but it did come to Denver. As of 1860, the city had about 4,479 people. Actually, I shouldn't say about. In the census that year, it was 4,479 people. Colorado Territory formed 1861. The territory of Colorado was pulled out of 5 other territories. For us here on the Front Range, the indication of that would be Baseline Road. For those of you living in Boulder and Brighton, Baseline Road was the dividing line between Nebraska Territory to the north, Kansas Territory to the south. Eventually, of course, as those western sections were sliced off, it no longer applied in the same way. It's an interesting note that the folks in Kansas and Nebraska, largely interested in farming, were not too bothered by having their western extremes sliced off. As one person said at the time, all those miners out there were killing each other, blowing each other up with dynamite and the like. We farmers here in the East don't need that rabble. Denver loses the title of capital to Golden in the 1860s for about 5 years or so. Golden, they thought, made a sensible choice for the capital because it was right where the gold came out of the mountains. So why not have it right there? As they said, the first flat place after you left the mountains, they made a city. Some folks disagreed. They ended up bringing it back to Denver. The bigwigs who were pushing for Denver to be the chosen child in the area did bring it back to Denver. We had a fire in 1863. Interestingly, we also got the telegraph in that year. So communication between other parts of the country and Denver established 1863. And we also discovered a new and exotic idea, building with fireproof materials. Actually, that's not so exotic, but at the time, it really hit folks as being something they should do after that terrible fire in 1863. So we had a lot of brick manufacturers open there in the mid 1860s. Eventually, Denver was so leery of fire that they would pass a law in Denver saying all buildings had to be made of brick or stone, and that would remain in effect into the middle of the 1900s. After a fire of 1863, flood of 1864, those were little disasters. A much bigger disaster is that the train bypassed us in 1869. We were afraid we were going to die at that point. Denver founded 1858, November of 1858. The next spring, cities start to sprout up around us like mushrooms after a rain, as they say. Littleton, Golden, Boulder, other communities were settled in that time period. Wheat Ridge, for example, is able to trace its roots all the way back to that. Please talk more about Baseline Road. All right, so Baseline Road was the dividing line that they used because it's the 40th degree of latitude. And so to them, it made perfect sense. It was already an existent spot on the map. So when they were dividing the Western territories, they went ahead and divided Kansas and Nebraska territories at that point. Interestingly, and I just learned this part, as they did the township and range system throughout the West, which is something that was not exclusive to Colorado, but was used from Ohio, Indiana, all the way west. Sheridan Boulevard served as one of those primary dividing lines, which is why in most of the area, Sheridan is the dividing line between 2 counties, Jefferson and Denver, Jefferson and Adams. Any involvement in the Civil War? We are going to come to that here on this very piece of paper, or this slide, excuse me. Baseline Road was very important as that dividing line when you had 2 territories on one side or the other. Boulder would have been in Nebraska, Denver would have been in Kansas. But after the creation of Colorado Territory, that no longer mattered. 1860, our first annexation into Denver. The city of Auraria joined Denver. It was actually here a few weeks before Denver. and we brought it into the fold. 1862, the Battle of Glorieta Pass. We did a tour there a few years ago. It's well worth a visit if you haven't been. Most of Colorado was pro-North. You were mostly talking Unionists in Colorado. Now, that's not to say there were no folks from the Confederacy here. We did have significant numbers of those, but really it was mostly pro-Union. So in the end, this territory definitely was going pro-Union. Our first territorial governor, Mr. Gilpin, William Gilpin, yes, I think his name was William, brought up the first troops to send off to fight for the Union. Eventually, though, those folks from Texas tried to come get our gold. The pro-Union forces here in Colorado went south, met them in what is today New Mexico, at that time not a state yet, and their Glorieta Pass, they fought and they won. So that is why Colorado was not taken for the Confederacy during the Civil War. If they had gotten all of that gold and been able to use it to pay for things, we might have had a very different turnout to things. So really no battles in Colorado. We sent folks elsewhere. 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre happened. Definitely a seminal moment in Colorado history concerning the interactions between the Americans from back east and the Native Americans who were already here. If you haven't been to the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, one of the tours that we're doing this year at the end of June, we are going off to visit the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, and we're going to get a tour of the place. It's not a happy visit, but it is definitely one that you should do if you haven't in the past. Okay. 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad completed. This was important for Denver hugely because if Denver did not get the train, everyone felt Denver would die. And in fact, the newspaper in Cheyenne crowed when the train was put through there, when it was announced. They said that Denver was going to wither on the vine, basically. Also, just an interesting note, even though it's not super around Denver, Wyoming became the first territory in the United States to give women the right to vote, 1869. Colorado would become the first state to give women the right to vote in 1893. Okay, my friend Sarah just tuned in. Hi, Sarah. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, let's talk about the fellow who started it all, shall we? Good old William Larimer. William Larimer, poor William Larimer. He was one of those guys who, good night, he was always trying to get there, but he never quite did. He was a champion city builder. He would build these cities. Usually they would wither away. And he was always certain that the cities would make him rich. He founded multiple cities during his time. Interestingly, the only one that really succeeded was Denver. We have onesies and twosies out there that you might still see signs of. If you look back through the record books, some of the ones he incorporated, we don't even know exactly where they were. But he was going to make his fortune out of making cities. So when he heard that there were gold possibilities out in the mountains, he came west. He ended up jumping another claim, the St. Charles claim, and he made the city of Denver. Now, he was not 100% certain what he was going to call it. His first thought was he would call it Golden City because of the gold, but in the end, he decided to do a tried and true method of currying favor from the olden days. He curried up to the territorial governor of Kansas. At that time, again, we were part of Kansas. His name was James Denver. He was hoping in so doing, this would become the county seat, maybe even the capital, and it worked. So we have a drawing of General William Larimer's cabin there in the upper right-hand side. That would be at the corner of 15th and Larimer, what is today's Larimer Square. And Janine is apparently having issues getting in tonight. And unfortunately, we did not give him the accolades he wanted. He did name a street after himself, other streets after his friends, Blake, Curtis, Stout, Winecoop, etc. But we did not choose him to be mayor. In fact, we did not put him into any large office in Denver. So his time in Denver was actually relatively brief. After founding the city of Denver, he would head back east, back to Kansas, where he would get involved in other things. eventually dying there and not returning back to the city that he had founded. He did give us a few other things, though. He gave us our first cemetery, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. And he gave us some other cities. We'll come back to that. Here are some pictures of the Kettle Arcade, which is just off Larimer Square. So if you have been to Larimer Square and gone into the Kettle Arcade and looked up, you'll see this art. On the right-hand side, that's the view of the entire arc and in the arcade. At the very back on the right-hand side, if you look up, you see the picture of General Larimer there. He had served as a general during the Mexican-American War, and he called himself general for the rest of his life. And you see, ostensibly, he was a surveyor. And there is a view of his cabin. You can't really see it in the picture, but if you look at that little urn-like thing, what you have pouring out of there, those are gold coins. And I like to think that with a wave of his hand, gold poured forth. So that was the power of this man. He could make gold appear. Now, this, of course, is an artist's interpretation. This mural was done back in 1981, 88, right in there. Suddenly, I can't remember the date. I haven't been out much since COVID started. But if you go to the Kettle Arcade, you'll get to see this there. So General William Larimer, he gave us a lot. He gave us our main historic shopping district, our first historic district. He gave us our city name, he gave us that street, and he gave us, as I mentioned a few moments ago, our first cemetery, which we're going to come to in a few minutes. By the way, a whole decade, I have a lot to cover. I apologize for the pace of my speaking. I realize it's pretty frenetic. If I rush past anything, just shoot a question into the chat and we'll try to come back to it. So of course, gold. The Native Americans were very miserable when gold was found because invariably, as one of them said, when gold was found, that meant an end to their way of life in the area. And it tended to be quite true. These are the many trails which ended up coming to the area so that folks could get to that gold. The Smoky Hill Trail ended right in downtown Denver. For those of you who know the intersection of Colfax and Broadway, the northwest corner there is a monument, the Pioneer Monument, and that honors where the Smoky Hill Trail came into Denver. You notice the trails also continue up into the mountains. So these are the ways that folks were getting to Colorado because we were not connected to the train to the wider world during the time period we're going to be covering tonight. Our first decade, our first 11 years of existence would see no train except for the Union Pacific through northeastern Colorado, and we'll get to that in a moment. Okay, William Larimer was never a man to do things in bits. So if you look at this street map, in the picture, north would be basically toward the right. So the orientation here is not like this. The orientation would be like this. So north is to the right. You see the South Platte River there squiggling along. You see the streets of Denver. To the left of Denver, which would be to the southwest, you have the streets of our predecessor, Auraria. Now, after William Larimer founded Denver, he crossed the river to the bluffs on the high northwest side of the river, and there he founded the city of Highland. A lot of people say to me, hey, Kevin, is it Highland or Highlands? Well, Highland was the city founded by William Larimer. It was annexed into Denver within just a couple of years. It really was not much of anything. We had a little cemetery there. Most of those, or excuse me, all of those bodies were moved over to the cemetery that Larimer made, and it just became part of Denver. That city of Highland stretched as far west as Zuni. Later on the west side of Zuni, about 20 years later, another city would be created, Highlands. So you have Highland and Highlands. Am I doing that right? Highland and Highlands. They were right next to each other. Zuni would have divided them. Highland on the east, Highlands on the west. So when people ask me Highland or Highlands, I just say, well, remember what side of Zuni you're on, and that will answer you. Today, we don't have to worry about it so much. Most people no longer say Highland. When they're by the river, they say Lohi. Everything else to the west of Zuni is now Highlands, which is what it was. Okay, so this crazy street map This is what was designed to be. When this map was created, trust me, not all of these streets existed. But I do want to draw your attention. If you look on the map where it says Denver, you see the D and the E in Denver. Right above Denver, DE, you have Champa, then Curtis, then Arapahoe, then Lawrence, then Larimer, and then look right above Larimer at the name of the street there. That is McGaw, big M, little c, big G-A-A. William McGaw, big M, little c, big G-A-A. That's a street name we don't have in downtown Denver anymore. Now we have all the other streets there in that section, but not any McGaw. Well, McGaw was married to several Indian women, Native American women, and because this land didn't belong to Denver, to Larimer, he sold out his wives so he could have a street name on there. So McGaw Street was named after that. The reason this was necessary is because there was a treaty written in 1851 saying that this land would belong to the Native Americans forever. So when William Larimer made a city here, he was breaking a federal treaty. He was breaking the law. In fact, Denver did not become a legally existent city until 1864. So the first 6 years of our lives, everyone from the East who came here was really an illegal squatter on someone else's land. So William McGaw's quote unquote gift to William Larimer made it look as if this was a legal affair. It wasn't, but it made it look that way. In the end, we removed McGaw's name because he was a drunk. Also because a gentleman brought another stagecoach to Denver. The Overland Stagecoach reached Denver at 15th and McGaw. So we got rid of McGaw and changed it to Holiday Street, H-O-L-L-A-D-A-Y. Unfortunately, Holiday Street, because that's where all the men arrived, that is what became our red light district. So eventually, 1887, after about 20 years of really frisky business, they ended up deciding to rename the street Market. It was called Market intentionally, ladies and gentlemen. It's not called Market because of hats or shoes or groceries. It was a flesh market. So the next time you're in downtown Denver and you see Market Street, the name is talking about the selling of sex, basically. Anyway, a little fun with our maps there. Oh, and by the way, if any of this should be something you would like more information on, just shoot me an email or a phone call, and I am happy to expound upon this. It does not bother me at all. So just say, hey. All right. So what is the oldest building in Denver? Well, if you want to find that, you would go out to the 4 Mile Historic Park, just east of what is today Glendale. You see Cherry Creek there, as it was once upon a time. Doesn't that look nice and natural? And then you find the residence of multiple folks there. The building on the left is a schoolhouse. The building on the right was the house. The Brantner brothers, Brantner, sorry, couldn't remember. There was no L in there. The Brantner brothers built this building on the right back in 1859, and they had that as their farm. Eventually, in the early 1860s, a lady would buy that, Miss Cocker, I think it was. Yep, Mrs. Cocker. She would buy that and she would expand it, put in bees, have an orchard, all this. A few years later, it would sell again, and Mr. Booth, too many names. Mr. Booth would buy it. Mr. Booth was the one who would really bring it into the service of those stagecoaches coming into Denver. The approach to Denver had 7 different numbered houses. So you can go out to Parker and see where the 20-mile house was. The 12-mile house is under Cherry Creek Reservoir. That's gone now. If you go to the 9-mile park and ride, why is it called 9 Mile? Well, that's where the 9-mile house was. That's where you would stop and you were 9 miles from Denver. These were places where you could stop, stay overnight, get a meal. The 4-mile station, the 4-mile stop, was the last one before you reached Denver. And because of that, what folks like to do here was get all dolled up, cleaned up, put on fresh clothing so that when they got into Denver, they would look their best. So the 4-mile house is an interpretation of that former farm turned into a farm and stagecoach stop. Eventually, this whole thing was donated to the city of Denver. So the house that you see there on the right-hand side, you see they did build onto the house. The section on the left is the original. The schoolhouse would come in later. The oldest building in Denver, 1859. All right. So the first newspaper in Denver also came in 1859, the Rocky Mountain News. I'd like you to look, please, right below where it says Rocky Mountain News. It says the mines and miners of Kansas and Nebraska. And look below that. It says Cherry Creek, KT, Kansas Territory, Saturday the 23rd of 1859, April 23rd of 1859. So the Rocky Mountain News beat out its competitor by, I think it was about 20 minutes, being the first newspaper to publish in the Rocky Mountain region. The newspaper made it almost to its sesquicentennial, folding just before that. That was a sad thing. The fellow who founded this, William Byers, he was a shameless booster. He would lie in order to get people to move to Denver. Really, anything that would sell was something he would say. He talked about being able to take paddle wheel boats down the South Platte River from Denver to Omaha and St. Louis. Any of you have seen the South Platte River? There's no way, even at flood, that I think a paddle wheel boat could make it from Denver down the South Platte. But if you saw it in the newspaper, then that might make you think we were more connected than we were. Byers was a bit of an idiot. He did not listen to the Native Americans when he said, or excuse me, when they said, you should not build in Cherry Creek. If you look at the picture at the bottom, these buildings that you see here are built in sandbars, basically in Cherry Creek. Well, the Native Americans say, you dummies, that's going to flood. Well, they didn't listen. And in 1863, the tiger of the prairie rose up and wiped it all away. I think I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Okay, I do want to mention, by way of giving you a view, that first annexation into Denver was the city of Auraria. If you look at the upper slide here, the picture is taken from Denver, and we are looking southwest into the city of Auraria. This large open area that you have in the foreground, that is Cherry Creek. Notice it's basically sand. On the other side, you have the city of Auraria. Today, this area you're looking at right now would be the Auraria campus. And if you look off, there's no Loretto Heights, no Harvey Park, no Bear Valley. There's a whole bunch of nothing in the distance. And that's because, of course, this was a very early time. Where does the city of Auraria get its name? Well, look at that very handsome fellow down there at the picture at the bottom. Welcome to Auraria Community Club, first gold rush town, 1828. In northern Georgia, they found gold back in 1828, and it was a very terrible thing for the locals. A lot of folks turned out to get that gold, and what they did is they ended up kicking a lot of those people off of their land. So we have the Native Americans in the area removed, and that first gold rush happen there in Georgia. They named it after the Latin word for gold, AU on the periodic table, gold, AURUM. I don't actually know how to say that in Latin, but I'm going to guess aurum. That's where they get the name for Auraria. The folks who founded Auraria in Colorado were from Auraria, Georgia. I wanted to see where the original Auraria was. Today, it is a suburb of Dahlonega in northern Georgia, if you've never been. There are only 4 buildings, so it will not take you long to visit. Okay, I mentioned a few minutes ago that Denver was squatting. They were on other people's land. The Treaty of Fort Laramie said that this land would belong to the Native Americans for the rest of time. But the United States in the late 1850s was basically busy with something else. President Buchanan, as he left office and turned it over to President Lincoln, said, I wouldn't be in your shoes for the world. Basically, there's no way. President Lincoln was going to inherit a maelstrom of unhappiness. And when the Civil War broke out, everything was focused back east. Denver really kind of floundered for the first half of the 1860s. There's no investment coming out here. No one's really paying any attention to us. We barely got this done. The federal government of the United States did renegotiate the Treaty of Fort Laramie, 1851, with the Native Americans, allowing for the original land grant for Denver. So this is what Denver was legally in 1864. If you look at the picture, You see the rectangle there, the lower border of that's street right there. That would be Colfax. We're going to come back to that in a few minutes. If you look, the western edge, that's over by the South Platte River, and the eastern edge, that's going to be over closer to Broadway. So part of the city of Highlands in there, Auraria and Denver. So that's that first city of Denver made legal in 1864. Now, that's not to say that no one was coming out here. We did have people coming out, some who were looking for gold, some who were fleeing the troubles back east. It did tend to be mostly men. There's this wonderful quote from the early 1860s. A man wrote, "Anytime a woman arrives by stagecoach, all the men in town would run to their windows and doors to gaze at her as one would at any natural curiosity." So I wonder what it would have been like for those women arriving to have the entire city of men staring at them. So as you may imagine, these women were very desirable because there weren't a lot of them. So the men who were looking for a wife, these women would have had their pick. So it was a great time in many ways to be a woman in Colorado. Okay, I guess I should have talked about this a few moments ago, but I'm just going to follow along the slides the way I had them. The Cherry Creek was referred to as the Tiger of the Prairie by the Native Americans, and that was translated into English. The name Cherry Creek actually comes from one of the two native tree species that grew along the prairies, the Front Range. We have cottonwood trees and we have choke cherry trees. Now, all the other trees that we brought out here and have been naturalized, the oaks and elms and tulip poplars and all these things, those have been naturalized here. But prior to that, you would have really only had the choke cherry trees and the cottonwood trees. And as I like to say, even in 1858, they knew that no one was ever going to want to shop at Choke Cherry Creek Mall because choking is no fun. So they dropped the word choke immediately, and it just became known as Cherry Creek, even though the plant is called choke cherries. Okay, so 1864, we have the flood. Look at this picture here, if you would please. Denver on the near side, Auraria on the far side, and all of those buildings that were in between have basically been washed away. And that included the offices of the the Rocky Mountain News. It was just washed downstream. Mr. Byers was able to get away, but everything he had in there was lost. All that we have left of that original 2-ton printing press is one of the arms that you would have used to pull the plates down onto the paper. So everything else lost. One of these days, in my imagination, we're going to find a 2-ton printing press downstream buried in the soil of the South Platte River because it was really never seen again. So look at this. Did the city of Denver learn? No, the city of Denver continued to build right next to Cherry Creek, even at times in Cherry Creek. It was not really until the flood of 1933, the Castlewood Canyon Dam failure, that we kind of changed that tune. But we'll come back to that when we do the 1930s. I don't even know what decade that'll be or what month that'll be. I guess in the late summer, early autumn. Anyway, so this was our first flood and it caused a whole bunch of damage. So 1863, 64, we had the 1-2 punch, fire, and flood. Now, the reason the fire was able to do such damage is because Larimer and the streets crowded around it would have been put together with buildings made of wood, all eminently burnable. This is a drawing of the main street, Denver's main shopping district today, back as it was in 1859. We quickly cut down all of the trees along Cherry Creek and the South Platte River to build these buildings. Wood was a super precious commodity. Notice not much by the way of landscaping and certainly no verticality to the city. I'll read this quote out to you for those of you who might not be up for reading this small text. Its treeless, grassless, brushless condition gave it an exceedingly uninviting appearance. Its motley, irregular, ugly structures of brick frame or log were calculated to cause nightmare in the brain of an unseasoned visitor. In this picture, you're looking at 15th and Larimer. If you look at the building on the left, that is at the corner of 15th and Larimer. The street that's moving away from us, believe it or not, is 15th Street. If you look off in the distance there, you're going to see the South Platte River far, far away. What do you see on the other side of the river, which would today be Low-High? And off to the left, you'd have Mile High Stadium and all those things. You see a barren hill. Now, the Prairie Dogs were there. You had Spanish bayonet and yucca and all kinds of great things. Where does the city of Wheat Ridge get its name? Wheat Ridge was named for a type of native wheat that grew abundantly in the area. So it's not that there was nothing there. It's just that there was no city there. We do have some trees down by the river. Eventually, of course, all this would grow up. Now, just a block down from the picture we just saw would have been 14th Street. Oh, by the way, 14th, 15th, 16th, all of those would come later. The first street grid in Denver, those were letters. What we today call the 16th Street Mall long ago would have been G Street, G for good. The street we just saw was F, fun, festival, etc. 14th Street, I bet you can guess what letter that would have been, ended up being the place where our second territorial governor, John Evans, that is where he built his house. So if you look at the picture on the left, that is a picture of the Evans residence. I put an arrow in there. The larger building behind it, that is the Denver Seminary building. None of those buildings you see in the picture on the left still exist. Our second territorial governor, John Evans, had his house at the corner of 14th and Arapahoe. How do we know? Well, partially because it's written down, but also there's a sign of that today. The building that you see on the right, that is what stands on that site today. That is the Hotel Teatro, but that was the Denver Tramway Company building. That was their headquarters. That was built by the son of Territorial Governor John Evans. The son, William Gray Evans, built the Denver Tramway Company building on the site of his father's former house. So the Evans legacy continues there. The Evans legacy is one we are hotly debating today in Colorado. I just learned a couple of days ago that the Byers Evans House Museum is no longer called the Byers Evans House Museum. Both the Byers name on the museum and the library have been removed. Evans may disappear from the mountain west of Denver as well. Not exactly sure how that's going to play out, but I suspect it will happen very soon. Why is this house important? Territorial Governor John Evans put his house at 14th and Arapahoe. He was the territorial governor. What that meant is all of the rich people of early Denver wanted to be near our territorial governor's house. So what that did is it made 14th Street the first Ritchie Row in Denver. So if you know where the Denver Center for the Performing Arts is, the Telephone and Telegraph Building, that wonderful blue bear, the Convention Center, that's 14th Street. That was our first mansion-lined row, and it's because Governor Evans put his house on that street. Now, eventually, all of those would be torn to the ground. There's nothing left of those mansions. The Chukovich house is the only one left in the area, and that isn't even a mansion. So if you ever wanted to know where the rich people started, it was on 14th Street. Now, do I have these out of order? There it is. I guess these are a little bit out of order. Okay, so look at this picture of the extent of the railroads in Denver, in Colorado in 1870. Now, our presentation tonight is going to end with 1869. So I'm actually going slightly ahead so as to set the stage for what I want to tell you. If you look way up in the upper right-hand corner there, you see a tiny little blip of train coming into Colorado and going through the city of Julesburg. That was the extent, the full extent of the Transcontinental Railroad coming through Colorado. It did not go through Denver, excuse me. Why? Well, west of Denver, you have mountains. Trains don't like mountains as much as they like nice and flat. West of Cheyenne, you have hundreds of miles of more distance that is flat. Now, there are mountains eventually, but you can get a lot farther west. So the Union Pacific went through Cheyenne. I mentioned that earlier. Again, if you look up there in Julesburg, that is the only part that had a part of the Union Pacific. Today, that is reflected up at the Fort Sedgwick Depot Museum in Julesburg. If you've never been, it's a very nice museum. Passenger trains no longer go through there. But this was the only place in Colorado in 1869 you could have gotten on a transcontinental train. Tom Noel, aka Dr. Colorado, and his colleague Stephen Leonard said of all of the challenges Denver was to face during the rest of the 1800s, none was more important to its emergence as a major Western metropolis than the building of railroads. Denver knew that without the railroads, we were not going to be anywhere. So in 1869, which is as far as we are going to get tonight, Denver still has no train. The folks in Denver knew Cheyenne would be the big dog. So in 1869, as we are bypassed, the folks in Denver start building a train to link Denver the 100 miles up to Cheyenne. And when we do our presentation next month, we will revisit the culmination of those efforts. So according to two great historians in Colorado, this would be something that was a major issue for us. And here you see a little bit why. Again, those other lines are going to come in 1870. Okay. You might not think this would be such an important thing, but it really was. Denver is a semi-arid area. Now, Stephen Long, the surveyor, the fellow who gave us Long's Peak, and the city of Longmont would be named in his honor, or I guess I should say he didn't give us Long's Peak, it is named in his honor. Stephen Long pronounced this area wholly unfit for cultivation and therefore for civilization. He didn't think of it as being something that we could irrigate, but in the end we realized that if we irrigated, we could do great things. Denver needed water. We were defecating and urinating and dumping trash in the creek and river right here in town. We weren't doing anything else with it. So you didn't want to drink the water in town. So what we needed was water brought from farther upstream. And so Smith's Ditch was created in 1867. This is partly a project of Richard Little from Littleton's Foundation and a gentleman, Mr. Smith, John Smith. They were inveigled into bringing this ditch not into downtown Denver, but into an area called Brown's Bluff. If you look at the picture on our left, or the map, excuse me, on our left, that is a screen capture from Google Maps. Thank you, Google, showing Smith's Ditch through Washington Park. And if you look at the picture on the right, that is the ditch still today, the city ditch as it's known in Washington Park. Quote, this vegetation produced a marked change in the appearance of the town. Nearly 1,000 miles of lateral ditches and branches meant that streams of clear, cold water flowed, allowing the city to purchase water for lawns, trees, and gardens. Denver was described as a sere place, a braggart humbug of a city. Without getting shade and beautiful flowers and plants in, we might well have remained that way. But in order to do that, we have to water it. Now, whereas Stephen Long called us a desert, writing on his maps, the Great American Desert, for a desert, you have to have 10 inches of precipitation or fewer. We are semi-arid, getting 13 to 15 inches of precipitation a year. That might seem a fine line, but there is really a big difference between what Las Vegas gets, which is 3 or 4, and what we get here, which is 13 to 15. So Smith's Ditch, one of the ways we made the city of Denver shady. Now, this is the fellow who greased the right palms so as to make himself incredibly wealthy. So this is Henry Cordis Brown. He found out that that investors were putting together the money to build a ditch into town. The plan had been, so is that ditch part of the Highline Canal? No. This ditch, completely different from the Highline Canal. The Highline would be begun in the 1870s, and it certainly is very close to where they started the Smith's Ditch, but those are different projects. So for those of you who haven't done the Highline Canal, it's a great bike ride or walk, depending on which resource. It is anywhere from 66 to 72 miles long. Even Denver Water, which now owns it, their own literature doesn't agree as to the length of the Highline Canal. It's a great thing to do in the summer. Maybe not so much today when it's kind of cold and snowy. Okay, Brown, that you see here, not related to Margaret Brown, found out that a ditch was going to be built. He had bought land southeast of Denver. He wanted to get rich. He didn't want to farm with his homestead. He wanted to get rich. So what he did is he went and greased the palms of Mr. Little and Mr. Smith so that that ditch would come not to downtown Denver where all the people were, which would have made way too much sense, right? But came to his section of town, which was derogatorily called as derogatorily known as Brown's Bluff. Brown because of its color. Quote, the builders on Brown's Bluff were regarded as rather singular men for choosing to go so far off in the country to build their houses, and the dwellings did look lonesome and forlorn, standing away out there by themselves. So what are we talking about when we say way, way out there by themselves? So let's talk about that, and I'll try to show you here on a map. All right, so this is a map from Google Maps. Thank you, Google Maps. If you look here in the picture, this green area down at the bottom, that is where Civic Center Park is today. And if you look off to the right-hand side of that, that is the Capitol. Notice you have Colfax there, that big yellow line. And then the diagonal streets, the upper left-hand side, that's downtown. This area that has the streets going like this instead of like this area to the east of Broadway, that is where Brown had his land. Larimer, which is way off to the northwest, Larimer, Lawrence, Market, Blake, all those over there, that's where town was. So what we think of now as Lodo was where everyone was. So Brown bringing the water over here was kind of comical. No one was there. In the end, he was the one who laughed last. If you see where the Capitol is, from the goodness of his heart, he donated 10 acres to serve as the territorial capital. He knew that with two things he would get rich. Number one, if he had the capital there, all of the richies would want to be near his land or in his land. And that was correct. The other thing that he knew these people would want, water. With that magnet of the building and the water, this area became what we know today, Capitol Hill, as Millionaire's Row. But notice the one thing he said. He said to the city of Denver, if you want my land, I don't want this type of grid. I want this grid. If you want my land, my 10 acres for the territorial capital, in my area, you will go from this to this. And so the city wanted the land. So in this area, they decided they would reorient the grid to what would be considered a standard orientation. So a lot of people complain and ask, Kevin, why are the downtown streets like this? It's so confusing. It makes these triangular lots, such as where the Brown Palace Hotel is. I always say, well, you shouldn't complain because technically the downtown streets are the ones that are original. It's the rest of the street that is the one that came second. Those are the wrong ones. These were the streets, the downtown ones, that's where the poor working people lived. This is where the rich people lived. So when we wanted to copy a street grid, we copied the grid that was used by the rich. So that's why the rest of the the metropolitan area uses that grid. Now, more to the story, but that's the basic part. Colfax, remember that southern boundary of the city of Denver, that southern boundary of the land grant. Well, it started out, its name was Grand Avenue. Well, Grand Avenue was a sensible name. That was our main drag coming into town. But we renamed it after the gentleman you see there on the lower right-hand side. That is Schuyler Colfax, a famous politician. He had a half-sister in Denver, and in the 1860s, he came out to visit her, and we, quote unquote, temporarily renamed the street in his honor. He became vice president during the first Grant administration. At that point, you would think it was certain his name would remain on there, but he was not vice president during the second Grant administration because he was implicated in a scandal where he was and others were stealing money from the federal government. He was found not guilty, but most people feel that was because his friend was the president of the United States. In the court of public opinion, Colfax was guilty, guilty, guilty. It didn't matter. We were used to the name. So that is why our main street in Denver, what Playboy magazine called the longest, wickedest street in the country, our main street in Denver is a street likely named after a crook. So I think that's totally marvelous, completely fitting somehow. At the national level, it is called Highway 40. It used to stretch from coast to coast, Atlantic City, New Jersey to Oakland, California, but they did circumcise it at its western edge, so it no longer reaches the west coast. It goes no farther west now than Salt Lake City. All right. Remember earlier I told you that William Larimer gave us our first cemetery. He named it Mount Prospect. Here is Mount Prospect Cemetery today, except that you might know it by a different name. Mount Prospect Cemetery today is Cheeseman Park. And here you see some people I took a picture of. They had no idea I was taking a picture, and I have no idea who those people are. Today's Cheeseman Park was a cemetery. In fact, it had three pieces: a Protestant cemetery, a Catholic cemetery, a Jewish cemetery. All of these were decommissioned over a 60-year period, and none of them are still cemeteries. By conservative estimate, Mount Prospect left behind 2,000 to 3,000 bodies beneath the surface. So next time you're in Cheeseman, just remember there are marvelous things beneath the surface, and we do know that they are there. Another batch of skeletons was found when they were putting in some sprinkler systems back in 2010, and one of my colleagues actually helped National Geographic with the examination of one of those skeletons. Ugh. All right, so William Larimer gave us our cemetery, which later on became a park. Okay, so I thought it was a Chinese cemetery, someone is saying in here. There was a part of the cemetery that would have had Chinese burials, but as a whole, it was not exclusively a Chinese cemetery. The cemetery, Mount Prospect Cemetery, was broken into divisions. If you look, and I didn't put it in here, but there are actually maps of the cemetery that show the divisions, the Odd Fellows and the the Masons. Other groups are listed on there. A section of the cemetery, which was called the Potter's Field, would have been also where the Chinese folks at the time would have been buried. And that would have been at the southwestern part of the cemetery. So again, part of Mount Prospect Cemetery. Okay, now I'm going to run out of time here, so I'm going to zoom along. This is a story you're probably thinking I was going to talk about later. The famous story of the Tabors would happen later, right? Well, no, it starts in the very early part of the 1860s when the Tabors come out here because Horace Tabor, there you see him with his giant mustache, decides he's going to bring his wife, Augusta, there you see her, and their son out west in order to get rich. And if you look at the map on the left-hand side there, you're going to see off to the very left-hand side, you're going to see the city of Oro City to the west of Fairplay there. They initially settled in Oro City, and then later on, they would move to Leadville. Augusta wrote, when they went into the South Park area, "I shall never forget my first vision of the park. I can only describe it by saying it was one of those Colorado sunsets." When I think there's a typo in there. I don't think the apostrophe S is supposed to be there. Sorry, my mistake. "Those who have seen them know how glorious they are." So the Tabors would get to Colorado the very beginning of the gold rush, and for more than a decade, they were basically just working. They were doing really anything that they could to make it pay. So he often would run sort of a mercantile. Augusta would work as a nurse, a school teacher. She would do laundry or a postmistress. So it was in the 1860s that perhaps the most famous love triangle in all of Colorado's history got its start. So we are actually going to talk about the Tabors for the next 3 months, and then we'll take a jump, and then when we get to the 1930s, we'll talk about the Tabors again. So we're going to return to the Tabors several times. Okay. All right, so we are right on time. I wanted to leave a little time at the end for questions. I am going to do some general all-purpose announcements here in a few moments, but I did not want to go without asking if you had any questions. Again, I completely apologize if I missed your favorite part of our early history in Colorado. There's really just too much to share. So I thought I'd leave a moment or two here for any questions. So do you have any questions? You may type them into the chat window, or you may unmute yourself. Okay, I don't see any questions going to be coming in. Oh, thank you. I'm glad it was fun. Okay, I'm going to go on to my general 4 Mile Park. So many holidays there. Why was the cemetery moved from Cheeseman Park? That's a great question. Originally, originally Mount Prospect was far away. It was far away from downtown Denver. Is this recorded so we can review it later if we want? Yes, it is. So Karen, just let me know and we'll get you all set. It was far away. Eventually, as the city of Denver expanded, you had people come up to the edge of the cemetery, and the cemetery was very ugly. So the folks who wanted to live out in that area said, hey, Kevin, can you get rid of hey, Kevin, hey, Denver, could you get rid of this ugly cemetery? We would rather have a park. And it wasn't just poor people, it was rich people who were asking for this to be done. And so that's what they did. They said, all right, we'll give you a park. So in the end, the area immediately to the west of Cheeseman Park, that's really where that push was happening. Humboldt Island, which is a historic district there on the west side of the park, was only able to become Humboldt Island because in the end, the city bowed to pressure from the well-to-do and they got those bodies mostly moved. So that's why Cheeseman was removed. Why is the Byers name being removed from Denver buildings? Byers encouraged the removal of Native Americans from Colorado, even by force or through uglier means. And because he pushed for the extirpation of the Native Americans from Colorado, his name is being removed from many places around the state. It's the same thing with Evans. The Sand Creek Massacre happened during his watch. Where was the Prospect Park Cemetery moved to? The majority of the bodies were moved to Riverside and Fairmount Cemetery. How and from where was water brought into Smith Ditch? It was brought out of the South Platte River. So way south in the Littleton area, they diverted water into Smith's Ditch and it came up to Denver from there. All right, so some upcoming tours. For those of you who don't know, I do have a brochure of my upcoming tours. If you don't have this, I'm happy to email it to you or send it to you through the mail. Some upcoming tours where we still have some space. Denver's fire departments, which is the history of how we fought fires in Denver. It's a day tour, February 26th. You might think that's not super interesting. It actually has a lot of very compelling stories attached to it. We are tracing our rivers. We're starting with the Arkansas River. Each year, we're going to do one of the 4 great rivers that comes out of Colorado. This year, we're starting with the Arkansas. We're going to trace it all the way from the Salida area to where it meets the Mississippi River. That's going to be in March. We're doing natural New Mexico. We're going to go down to see Bandelier National Monument. It is a super fast trip, but it's going to be a lot of fun. We're going to visit Los Alamos. And one I'm very excited for, we're going to return to Amache and southeastern Colorado, June 28th through July 2nd. Ladies and gentlemen, all of that's in here. If you'd like one of those, just let me know. I hope you enjoyed tonight's presentation. I will see you again next month for the 1870s. Please don't be shy about shooting me questions. I really don't mind. I'm going to put my contact information in here one more time. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining tonight. And I hope you stay warm and have a fine evening. Thank you and good night.